And I'm Jane Harmon, a recovering politician, now the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I want to welcome you to the last day of Resilience Week. As a Californian, I understand resiliency. I certainly recall the earthquake drills. I also recall the nuclear bomb drills in the 50s and so forth. And I spent decades in Congress, it felt like at least 100 years, working to make our homeland more resilient, especially the function of our major ports. The Port of Los Angeles, which with the Port of Long Beach is the major port complex in our country, was in my district. And 50% of the U.S. container traffic goes in and out of those ports. There was, on my watch, a labor strike, and the loss of fresh food and goods throughout our country from that strike, which only lasted a few days, was enormous. So I get it about resiliency. Over the last 4 days, the Wilson Center has hosted 50 global leaders from the world's only Resilience Academy. That's kind of cool, isn't it? And as the only think tank with a program on global resilience, we're really pleased to be one of the leading partners of this initiative. Roger Mark D'Souza, right there, shy, unfriendly man, is the able, yes, I just contradicted myself, but that goes on a lot in this town these days, is the able director who has led our program for the last 4 years, bringing his decades of experience from his prior work at the Sierra Club, Population Action International, and I guess, did you work for USAID or you just had a contract for USAID?
Ongoing contract.
Contract, okay. Anyway, I want to thank the Munich Re Foundation, the UN University, and the International Center for Climate Change and Development from Bangladesh for your support. Today, we are very pleased to welcome our partners to our Coastal Resilience Initiative. Together with Hoover and Stanford University, we have convened 3 conversations on the challenges facing coastal communities across the United States. Rising sea levels, stronger storm surges, faster floods. Coastal towns and cities are at the front lines of a changing climate. And I just would comment that my official residence is in Venice Beach, California. Someone has to live there, so it might as well be me, even though I work here. And all along the coast there are signs for tsunami zone. So communities are taking this seriously. We've brought together scientists, policymakers, and the private sector to develop shared solutions to the deadly disasters threatening our citizens from California to the Caribbean. It's clear that we must protect the economy and infrastructure that protects our people. Energy systems, military bases, transportation, ports, tourism, and fishing are all under siege right now, especially in Puerto Rico. Thank you to Alice Hill, I haven't seen her since last week in Reykjavik, and Chris Field for partnering with us on this important challenge. It couldn't come at a more critical moment. And by the way, I was listening to Alice talk about rebuilding critical infrastructure, I think in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, and saying, why do we rebuild to old standards when we know that storm surge and other challenges are going to defeat the rebuilt architecture too? Why aren't we thinking about future standards? Well said, Alice. Now we are listening. So we have folks here today from every continent except Antarctica. Roger Mark, why isn't somebody from Antarctica here? What is wrong with you? And Wilson himself, Wilson the man, would be proud to see this League of Nations. We are eager to learn from efforts to build, laughing is good, coastal resilience in Bangladesh, Fiji, and the Caribbean, and find out how here in the United States we can do better and be better neighbors. Whether we're repairing bridges or rebuilding fragile states, we can only become resilient together. Welcome to everyone.
Thank you, Jane. It's just so wonderful to have this culmination of our efforts from all of our partners. I think many of you are very familiar with the Wilson Center. We are established by Congress as a living memorial to President Wilson. Some of you know that we were voted as the #1 think tank in the world for transdisciplinary work. And this is really critical because as we look at the different components of resilience, as Jane has outlined, it's quite clear that it crosses many disciplines. And you've just learned from Jane that we're the only think tank that has a global resilience effort. So we're very proud, and it is with a great deal of pride, humility, responsibility, and commitment that we are really able to have this dialogue with you this afternoon. We want to learn from each other. We want to focus on what we know, what is the evidence, but also what is practical, what can we do, what makes sense from a policy perspective, but also from a programmatic perspective. Where are we failing and where are the innovations? How can we be ahead of the curve? How can we be anticipatory? And as we say in our resilience work, how can we be transformative? So I'm really pleased that we will be able to share these perspectives with a number of colleagues in our 2 panels this afternoon. And I'd like to welcome Alice and our colleagues for the first panel to join me up on the stage, please. So many of you are familiar with Alice Hill. Alice actually helped us kick off our Resilience Week earlier this week on Monday. Alice is currently a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, where her work focuses on building resilience to destabilizing catastrophic events, including the impacts of climate change. Prior to joining Hoover, she served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Resilience Policy at the National Security Council. While at the White House, she led the development of national policy regarding national security and climate change, the incorporation of climate resilience considerations into international development, and federal efforts in the Arctic, including issues around building national capabilities for long-term drought resilience and the establishment of national risk management standards for 3 of the most damaging natural hazards. I couldn't think of a better colleague, friend, and partner to kick us off this afternoon. So Alice, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Roger Mark, and thank you, Jane. What a delight to be here at the Wilson Center. As Jane mentioned, we were just in the Arctic, and if you want to visit a place that is on the front lines of finding ways to be resilient, it's in the Arctic. It is getting so warm there so quickly and having profound consequences for their infrastructure as well as their economy. Lessons from the Arctic could greatly inform our work here in the United States and elsewhere internationally. I come from a legal background. Our legal system here in the United States is based on the common law, the English common law. So it's primarily based on precedent. What happened in the past very much guides what occurs in the resolution of our legal disputes. One of the refreshing things that I found in working on climate change is you never hear what I heard frequently as a lawyer and then as a judge. Oh, that will never work. We've already tried it and it doesn't go anywhere. With at least climate resilience and truly resilience to an interconnected systems in our world, you don't hear that. We're really trying for the first time to find solutions to extremely challenging problems. And that's why I'm very excited to have an opportunity to participate in this panel, which will look at what has worked so far, and then importantly in the nascent efforts that we've had, if we've discovered that they hadn't worked, doesn't work, we need to also share that knowledge quickly so that others can learn from what we've done. We have no time to spare. The Arctic makes that clear, and recent events in 2017 here in the United States with wildfires and the 3 hurricanes which I've learned can be called HIRMA, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, at least as we're trying to talk about that phenomenon, have shown us that we have a long way to go to be resilient here in the United States. So with me, to my immediate left is Thomas Loester. He spent 16 years as a member of the Geo-Risk Research Group at Munich Reinsurance Company, and I would say the reinsurance company. It is one of the world's largest reinsurance companies and has been a leader worldwide in drawing attention to the great risks posed by a changing environment. In 2004, he was appointed chairman of the Munich Re Foundation. He is also an executive board member of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, which tries to establish insurance mechanisms for the poor. And he's also been a frequent teacher and lecturer in educating many, many people about the risks that are posed. Next to him is Aaron Darrington. Aaron is the Permit Manager and Coastal Resources Specialist for the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands Bureau of Environmental and Coastal Quality. She's with the Division of Coastal Resource Management. She is also a reformed lawyer. She has her law degree and a master's in environmental science. She has supported efforts to identify best practices for national adaptation strategies. And she also has on her bio something I have never seen in a bio before. She is a spelunker. And finally, we have Kees Vandergest. He is a senior researcher at the UN University Institute for Environment and Human Security in Bonn. He currently oversees work on loss and damage from climate change in vulnerable countries. He has conducted a 5-year research project about livelihood resilience in Bangladesh. He has also made 2 award-winning documentaries about rural life in the savanna of northern Ghana. They also represent a great geographical spread. We have Kees in Spain, Thomas in Munich, and Aaron in Saipan. So with that, we will hear initially from each of them, and then we will have an opportunity for questions from our audience. I'm going to turn to Erin first, and she will share with us some of the regulatory changes that have been put in place aimed at building resilience.
Thank you.
Oh, this looks like it's the clicker, if that's what you need.
That might be helpful. Good afternoon, everybody. Half a day, as we say in Saipan. And show of hands, I know it's hard after lunch, but who here knows where Saipan might be? That's more people than I expected, actually. Yes, that might save me a slide or two.
Don't test it.
Well, so as the PowerPoint is loaded, let me just say that thank you again for taking the time to join us in this important conversation today. I have been working in climate adaptation and resiliency building for a while now, and it is a great opportunity to be able to work in an island environment. Coastal communities are so much more vulnerable than many others, perhaps, to the impacts we are seeing from climate change, and it presents unique challenges as well as unique opportunities to actually address these impacts. And today I'll be speaking to you primarily about how we are addressing these impacts from a regulatory level, although there are certainly many ways we are approaching this in my work. Since slides are not forthcoming, I'll just start. So we are located in the middle of the Northwest Pacific, essentially. We're about 120 miles north of Guam. The island territories span about 300 miles, so we are small geographically, but we are large ocean states, as we like to start reframing the island dialogue. The majority of the population of about 60,000 people lives on Saipan, which is approximately 44 square miles in size. The territory overall is about 183 square miles of land. That's 475 square kilometers. And we are a U.S. territory. So in the 1970s, 1972, they began speaking about the territorial affiliation with the United States. I could spend a week talking to you about that dynamic in particular. And so let me just say that in 1978, we did adopt our own state constitution, became a territory, and that comes with unique challenges and opportunities. But I would like to highlight that we are one of, the last time I checked, 6 states and territories that has the constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment, and that drives a lot of the work that we do as well. And so since 1983, we have had a Coastal Zone Management Act at the state level that basically is implementing NOAA's Coastal Zone Management Act. And through this, my agency, the Bureau of Environmental and Coastal Qualities Division of Coastal Resources Management, has a mandate to work on balancing development and wise coastal use, coastal resource use for current and future generations. So for those of you that are not horribly familiar with the Coastal Zone Management Act of the United States, it essentially enables funding for states and territories to implement their own coastal management programs. And it provides an enormous amount of flexibility. And so every coastal zone program is somewhat different. But essentially, in the CNMI, our agency functioned as the primary zoning and development authority from 1983 until 2008, when we had a zoning office created on the island of Saipan. So much of the work we do is really working to identify risks and respond to vulnerabilities in order to make sure that the resources we steward are going to be providing the ecosystem services and functions that enable our islands to operate. We are 90% driven, our GDP is 90% reliant on tourism, and so we need to keep our coral reefs, our wetlands, our streams healthy if we want to continue that trend. So the regulation updates that I want to talk to you about today really primarily aim at reducing risk of significant impacts associated with land use planning and development in the region. We also do so much work in our agency, and I couldn't encapsulate it all in 10 minutes, but I will talk to you briefly about some of the other programs that we engage in that support these efforts that include monitoring and assessment of these ecosystems and ongoing education, outreach, and engagement. Now, I had a very wordy slide here I was going to show you about what we actually include as coastal resources. And really, just to summarize it, it includes physical and natural resources, but it's so much more than that. And so in our enabling legislation, our legislature said that coastal resources includes socio and cultural resources. This includes public access, historical and cultural sites, water-dependent uses, scenic views, as well as, of course, ecologically significant resources, our lagoons and reefs, our wetlands, seagrass, shorelines, and also other significant natural resources such as our limestone forests, water quality, air quality. So we run the gambit. And we work very closely with our sister agency, Division of Environmental Quality, who works on administering EPA's environmental standards. So we are both sitting in the same house, and that makes for a very effective partnership. I also was going to show you a slide about risks and impacts. But I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Everybody knows that we are seeing increasing temperatures, sea level rise, storm surge, inundation. One of the things I did want to highlight, though, is in 2014 and 2015, we completed vulnerability assessments for the island of Saipan, Tinian, and Rota, respectively. And what those did is they modeled sea level rise and inundation using a bathtub model on Saipan. And that is being used to inform conversations we are having in the 2017 enabled governor-mandated resiliency working group. We're trying to look to basically reducing some of those risks at a systematic level. So it goes without saying that people living in coastal communities are already observing impacts, and although that is a challenge, it is also an opportunity and a driver for change and innovation. In addition to some of the slower onset impacts we are experiencing. Well, let me just skip right through. There are the Mariana Islands. This is our mission with CRM to promote conservation and wise development of our coastal resources. And I should acknowledge we are 100% federally funded by NOAA, and we appreciate that ongoing support. It's very important and necessary. Coastal resources, very broadly defined. and some of the impacts we are already seeing and projected to see more of in the future. So, discussing these impacts, we have, again, seen periodic flooding. We're experiencing periodic droughts. We have seen water disruptions, food disruptions already. And these experiences have made, I believe, our community more accepting of the idea that we need to have conversations now about how we can build resilience of our ecological, social, and economic systems, which are, of course, integrally connected. And so what I wanted to also mention is that in 2015, we had one of the most active typhoon seasons in the Pacific. And one of those typhoons, Typhoon Sotalor, was a direct hit, a Category 4, upon the island of Saipan. Approximately 80% of the island was without power. Some of the people there were without power for a month and a half to 2 months. We had extreme water distribution such that we had the National Guard came in, the Marines came in to help distribute water to people. And so there were very real, very severe impacts, which in part has been a driver to these conversations about building system redundancy and resilience throughout our different systems as well. So the regulation updates that I've been working on basically are aimed to address some of the challenges we've been seeing. And just to summarize them in a nutshell and then go into a bit more detail, these regulations are basically trying to identify areas where there is environmental risk associated with development and reduce that risk as much as possible. So already we manage flood zones. We have things called areas of particular concern and FEMA flood zones, the V and VE flood zones that are associated with coastal storm surge flooding are reflected in these areas. However, one of the new regulation updates that is a bit innovative for us is that we are now going to be requiring projects in these areas to consult with our office, the Office of Zoning, and the Department of Public Works that manages the building code early in their development process if they happen to be sited in one of these areas. And of course, we hope to work with FEMA in the future to update these maps as they were completed in 1990 and maybe in need of a little bit of a revision. We are also experiencing terrestrial flooding in some areas, and so we are encouraging implementation of green infrastructure elements such as permeable paving, rooftop gardens, and related best management practices. We are actually requiring that these best practices be considered in high priority watershed areas that are experiencing water quality degradation. And these include the tourist area of Garapan, Lalo Bay, and Talakaza, which if you work in the region, we've done a lot there for coral restoration as well. We are also encouraging developers to consider living shorelines and green interventions as opposed to more traditional gray interventions. And in fact, consideration of this is required for major siting projects, which are also specifically defined, such that if a project proponent would like to put in hard infrastructure, a seawall, for example, we would like them to demonstrate how the other more green interventions would not be appropriate in that location. We've actually worked closely with the Army Corps of Engineers to develop a conceptual study of what these different interventions might look like and how there are green to gray options that could be very appropriate and scalable in island communities. Oh, a lot of words. I know this is bad practice for PowerPoint, but the words in purple here are important because what we've done is for our large projects, we would like to incorporate the requirement that projects consider mitigation of adverse impacts. And this includes looking at current and future projections of sea level rise and coastal flooding. And I believe that is a bit of an innovative incorporation into regulations as well. So where it is possible, we would like them to use the data that we have available, and that data has been put in an online mapping system, the public permitting app that you can visit our website, crm.gov.mp, navigate, download, and we use a C2 sea level rise projection scenario, 50 years of sea level rise with a 10-year storm surge, to look at areas that may be particularly at risk. And where development is occurring there, we would like them to talk about options to reduce impacts of that sea level rise to the project itself and vice versa. You can see there that area in dark blue is pretty much our tourism center. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of reducing impacts to some of the lifeblood of our economy, essentially. Another way we are trying to improve development is by incentivizing better development practices. And so for us, this looks like permit fee reductions. We have costs associated with permitting, and so we figured if we could give developers a bit of a carrot, maybe they would consider LEED certifiable building, as well as redevelopment of existing buildings when they are planning their projects. And so, again, trying to encourage and incentivize best practices where they can be identified. And to that end, we realize this is just the very beginning in best practices for development. And so we are investing in trying to identify other ways that development can become more low impact moving forward. We currently have 3 RFPs out for looking at best practices in construction, operations, and climatization of structures. There's also the issue of enforcement. So our permit conditions are tailored to try to minimize to the greatest extent practicable any significant negative effects on the environment of these projects. Where developers fall short and perhaps do not follow through with these conditions, we take enforcement action. And so we are also proposing an update in our regulations that will basically codify a policy of allowing for supplemental environmental projects that will be better tailored to address the impacts of the violation. So traditionally, if you have a violation, you pay money and you've been punished, and that's great. But what we would like to see is actually that investment going back into mitigating the impact that has occurred. And so what this has looked like on the ground is building rain gardens. It's installing green roofs. It's putting up signage talking about the importance of preserving shoreline vegetation. And so those have capacity building outcomes, I believe, and enhance the resilience of the systems themselves more so than a dollar value might. That's a picture of our first green roof resulting from an enforcement action. And then we're really working to broaden the implementation of the mitigation hierarchy so that development projects avoid impacts before they occur. And this can happen early in the planning process, and so I've been working a lot with investors to try to, again, have early planning dialogues about what impacts they might be considering early in their process such that they could avoid those impacts and not have to pay for mitigation down the line. However, where mitigation is necessary, we have recently adopted a mitigation hierarchy policy that codifies a no net loss approach to wetlands, seagrass, and coral reefs. A no net loss approach to wetlands is fairly standard under the Clean Water Act, but I believe that the adoption of seagrass and coral reefs in that dialogue is new and innovative and could be hopefully trend-setting throughout the Pacific as well as our colleagues for our colleagues on the mainland. And as I said, we're doing so much more. And so my part of our section, the permitting section, is just one of many people doing great work in our agency. So we have an education and outreach department that is specifically targeting youth. We're also working, of course, to engage with the adult community, but we have climate education campaigns that are integrated with 4th and 9th grade curricula that have been fairly successful so far. We have a lot of community engagement efforts, be it photo competitions. We have a reef report app so that people can more directly connect with enforcement actions should they need to. And we also have a lot of community-based planning efforts underway for our lagoon as well as for our ocean resources. So a lot is going on, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share our work with you today, and I look forward to being able to talk about some of these challenges and opportunities in more detail. Thank you very much. Sisu Samasi alumni.
Thank you, Erin. You describe a baseline that I think many communities here have, outdated maps. And if you have the map, it certainly doesn't include climate risk. But you have gone forward and really been highly innovative from at least my knowledge base on requiring consultations, a demonstration why you want hard infrastructure, getting in early on the process. This is the type of model that is not widely disseminated in the United States, and I think it's one of the reasons we find that we walk into realizing what we just built might not have accomplished the goals we have. So very exciting. I do have one question for you. Have you met much resistance in trying to get these regulations into place?
Thank you for that question. And one thing I didn't talk about is the outreach and the engagement that we incorporated into this process. And so we've had 6 rounds of public meetings about these regulation changes. We actually work with a agency board that ultimately adopts these proposed measures. And so I've had numerous discussions with them, trainings regarding specific resource management issues. And generally, I'd say 90% of the community has been incredibly supportive because they do see that connection of keeping these systems healthy and their livelihoods. And so that's been really a refreshing environment to be working in, given the national political climate that we're in. We do, of course, have people that object to the incorporation of some of these principles, and many of those folks that have actually been consultants that, it's my opinion, just need to be educated a bit more. And so that's part of the work that I'm doing as well.
Great. Thank you. Well, we'll turn to Thomas now, and he can share his work about Caribbean islands and different ways to help them find insurance mechanisms or bond mechanisms to build resilience.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So it's a privilege to be with you here, Alice. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Mark, for inviting me. So excuse my rough accent. I'm a Bavarian and might make it difficult for you. And I'm an insurance veteran. For 16 years, I worked on the for-profit side, insurance solutions for the rich world, and since 12 years, insurance solutions for the poor world. So I know it all, and I will share a bit of our work in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And I will also show how insurance can serve climate change adaptation. But you see, when Jane opened, she ended with saying we can solve the problems only together. And so this is the place for the policy making here and bringing science and policy decision makers together. So, and also inviting the private sector, as we heard. But then when we talk about public-private partnerships, we always, and I look up the definition in the Cambridge Dictionary, an arrangement where a government and a profit-making company invest in and work on an activity together, like partnering policy and the private sector. And I think this concept is wrong with what we discussed here. So I asked Google, show me a politician. Google gave me fancy pictures of politicians, so I used this anonymized one link, left-hand side, and a businessman on the right-hand side, which is the PPP as it's understood, but we say we can only solve if we include all of the affected people, because they are at risk and they are the first actors on the ground. So we should widen the concept of PPP. And I will show you an example of a perfect PPP, which is an insurance product in the Caribbean. But once we come to talk about the insurance in the Caribbean, many of you know that there is the oldest pool for insuring governments, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Facility. And they pay out every year after hurricanes. And so just now with Irma, they paid $31 million to countries such as Anguilla, the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos. And very immediately, because governments need always money, of course, but they need it in an emergency. After a while, there's a protection gap, and then they need money for reconstruction. And this facility gives them money in the critical phase. They pay out after day 10. So the governments get 30 million, and then they can rebuild bridges and do the most important things. But this is a governmental solution, well known, well respected. So we thought in the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, we also must serve the people on the ground, not only the governments. Of course, people benefit from these solutions as well, but what about the poor people on the ground? So Hurricane Thomas hit, unfortunately my first name, hit the area and devastated islands in the Caribbean and St. Lucia and other islands. St. Lucia lost a large percentage of GDP, and this is some impressions from the area. So the initiative, I'm on the executive board, thought about a product that would serve the people there in the island. And so in my dreams, I see this man selling fruits with this lousy boat. He has an income of $15 a day. So what if a large storm comes, his boat flips over, he needs money to repair it, and he cannot go on with his business, but he has an income. So this, I perceived, would be a client for a policy, helping him for heavy winds or heavy rain. But then I asked the players in St. Lucia and in Jamaica, and they said, no, we show you our perception of who's a client. You see, of course, a pregnant woman having lost her house. She definitely needs money immediately. A banana seller, a fisherman, a construction worker, or a person working again in the banana industry. So these are the guys who have an income every day, and they can share maybe $1 a week or so to get protected by a policy. So we put up a scheme in 3 islands, and here you see why I call it a PPP. This is negotiations, showing on the very left-hand side the private sector person from Allianz Insurance, showing the politician in the middle with the red T-shirt, and showing farmers who run a farmers association. And you see this old lady on the right-hand side and our ambassador from MCI who negotiate what do these farmers need. It's a long process to learn what these farmers need, and here again you see the direct insurer in St. Lucia, you see the CEO and his assistant, and you see a lady who works for the tourism industry, and she explained what the tourism industry needs as a coverage: a taxi driver, a boat owner, a kiosk owner. So we developed the policy, and this is a menu in a typical pub in St. Lucia. We developed the policy, so if you save the cost for lunch meal 3 times, you can buy your first policy already. So I think this is really breakthrough, because people save a little money, they don't go out for eating three times, and then they have the first policy. So the basic cover is you can buy 1/10 of the policy. It's approximately $30, and you can go up to 10 of these policies and get a sum insured of $3,700 for heavy rain, heavy winds. And this is of course great, because if you have a car to repair, a boat to repair, you might need $1,000, and it's up to you to buy the cover in slices, as said. So we put the policy in place. And only a few weeks later, we had a 100-year storm event in St. Lucia on Christmas Eve. And you see this street fully torn away. It connects the airport to the capital. And you see that this is real damage. And you see that these people really need money. And here you see a bridge torn away. And it's not a new bridge. It's a Hurricane Thomas substitute bridge, which is there since 2010. But you see it cuts off the villages, and it's harming economy, and they need money. So this is hard to see for you, but we put up a scheme where, as said, these people can buy a cover, and then we learned it was only 3 years. There were 4 trigger events on one island and 2 on the other island. So at every larger storm or rain event, it paid out. So the private sector partner, which in this case was Munich Re, is not amused. If you create a policy, they have to pay out every other year. So this is now under reconstruction. But as said, it's very helpful for these people to sustain weeks if they are hit by a hurricane or a heavy storm. Now come to Erin. I knew she would be speaking before me, so I show a wonderful picture of a reef, because in this respect I have perfect news for you from the science side, because the insurance industry has just entered the reef business. And this is difficult because what is the value of a reef? You mean 500 million people depend on reefs, 25% of fish have a home in reefs. In poor countries, 25% of fish catch happens around reefs. They are really economically important also for tourism. So we were sitting in our Munich Re Foundation, the phone rang, and the Nature Conservancy called us, I now say TNC, and they said, oh, wouldn't you like to build with us reef insurance? And so Christian, who you know, and I, we said, oh, we had no idea. I'm an ecologist, so how we would do it. So, and since we as a foundation cannot do business, we handed it over to the business side of Munich Re and looked what they would do with this idea. But before I talk about the solution which was being created, I must refer to hurricanes and to so-called cat bonds, because maybe you have heard there's a new cat bond out, and cat bonds are transferring risk from the insurance side to the banking sector. Investors buy the risk and they get a large return for giving their money, and with this countries can sustain earthquakes in California or in Mexico or hurricanes. So here's just from 2015 that Heritage has released 3 cat bonds worth 277 million. So in case a hurricane would destroy the area, this insurer would get 270 million, and this would help then finally the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund. So this is an instrument which was introduced after Hurricane Andrew, and as said, it transfers the risk to the banking side. So this is how it looks, and you can't read it because you should not read it. What I just want to tell you, it's a very complex construction because it includes interest, it includes premium, it includes the legal area, and it includes, of course, many money flows, and this is a typical construction I'm happy to share with you. Just telling you it's not so easy to transfer risk to a banker who has no idea about exposure and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to do it. And so like 2 years ago, there was a new idea, and TNC, when they came to us, they were part of this idea. Here you see what my intern put together for me. She put up a nice island with all these hazards, and you see the resilience bond, which is a kind of cat bond, but it involves action on the island. It's not about giving just money. It involves that something is being built to protect the island, and this is called resilience bond, and you will hear it very often in your life. You say, oh, we put out a cat bond or a resilience bond, but you must know this is a really new thing, and when I talk to the resilience bond managers at Munich Re, he says, we have not one in place. So it's very fresh, so don't be, it's more lip service, but it's a brand new and a brilliant idea. And also for the US, these resilience bonds are being under debate. There's a forest resilience bond, and the idea is pretty clear. You invest in improving the quality of forest, you save spendings for fire police, and you get more water, better water retention. So this is a dividend, and this you can give back to the investor. And this is a typical resilience bond because the investor gives the money to improve this large forest system, and he gets back money. In Miami, there's a debate about a 63 miles seawall protecting Miami, and this would be a typical example for a resilience bond. Like you put a wall which is protecting the coast, and it's lowering the risk. And while the wall is being built up, risk gets lower, premiums get lower, and money cash flows come back to the investors. And coastal protection in Hoboken, New Jersey. This came when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, and you know it was flood, and so Hoboken in New Jersey is definitely in New York. And if you remember Sully in 2009 landing this airplane on Hudson River, Captain Sullenberger, this is exactly he entered into Hoboken, which is a part of New York City there. And you see on the left-hand side how it looked during Sandy 2013. Was flooded, and then it was a huge debate on we have first to rebuild and we have to protect it by insurance mechanism. So again, there was this debate, why not put up a resilience bond that investors invest in safety and insurance, and while the seawalls are being built up, the risk is lowered, premiums can be lowered, and money can return to the investor. And this is a fantastic idea which is born in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. And now coming back to Erin and to my friends who love the reef so much, and the TNC story. So they came to us, and the Munich Re guys, they said, "Ooh, this is difficult." And I'm an ecologist, so I said, "You cannot do it. A reef will take decades to grow." So. And then the TNC said, "Oh, we are also speaking with Swiss Re, who is a competitor of Munich Re." And they said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And they said, "Oh, we can speak about it, but it's a beach rehabilitation in Cancun, including the reefs there, these nice reefs. But we can tell you, and that's why I can't tell you. But when the Munich Re guys calculated this resilience bond, and here you see a picture like a coral reef protection mechanism protecting the coastline, and a degraded reef on the lower hand side, and water gets higher, gets in and destroys the coast and protections there. So they detected a great value of this reef and resilience bond. And honestly, it's not like seeding a reef, but it's putting up a massive wall around the coast and then seeding a reef, which will then grow over years and decades, and thus serving ecosystem services plus coastal protection. So they have calculated it, actuaries, and they don't waste money. And they said it's economically proof, it's ecologically proof. Aaron will tell maybe later in a few years. So with this idea, now with Fiji hosting COP23, they will go to the countries, to the low-lying islands, and say this might be one way out, and this is what we call a resilience bond. So they have loss curves, and Munich Re guys, of course, have fancy loss curves, and they can calculate to what extent a reef is lowering the risk and thus lowering also the damage. And I think it's a wonderful idea, and I think it's a wonderful news that the insurance industry is now entering this new arena in new solutions, also serving ecology. So take home, challenges can only be solved in partnerships, so always talk to the people on the ground. Resiliency is becoming, and we talked like hell about resiliency and concepts this morning and the whole week, but it's now more and more becoming a widely accepted concept, and the industry is starting to engage in this wonderful new business, and I hope to see good results in some 10 years. Thank you for your attention.
Well, this is terribly exciting news, and I'm not even a scuba diver, but just to hear about protection of the reefs, building of reefs, and then focus on individuals so that, and the focus on getting money back to sovereigns quickly. Remarkable work, very innovative. Sometimes when we talk about climate change, it can give you a sense of being overwhelmed. These are fantastic solutions, as Aaron was providing as well, of helping communities make smart choices that get them ready for the impacts that are here and will continue. So with that, I'm going to turn to Case, who will talk to us a bit about his climate migration work and looking at what humans do in the face of climate risk.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, all organizers. I might have to rush through my slides a little bit. So, if you have any questions for clarification, or you want to have more detailed information later, just drop me an email. I put the email address at the end. Yeah, sorry. So I'll be talking today on behalf of the rest of the team I'm working with. You'll see a picture of them. This is Juno, and the lead of this project is Maxine Burkett, Professor Maxine Burkett at University of Hawaii. And then Mark Steggy, he's from the Marshall Islands, and me, when I had a little bit more hair. I'm taking you in this presentation to the Marshall Islands. This is a project of 2 years, and we are almost at the end of year 1, so the findings I present are a little bit preliminary. So Marshall Islands is one of the lowest lying islands of states in the world, and because of that, it's really very vulnerable to sea level rise. And with sea level rise come risk of higher impacts of flooding, because of sea level rise. When tidal waves come, they penetrate deeper into the land, leave salinity there, and that affects fresh water. It affects the soil, and indirectly that affects people's health, food security, livelihoods, etc. So at the same time, we are seeing that from the Marshall Islands, there's really quite a massive migration flow. So currently there are like 55,000 people living on Marshall Islands, and where like in 2000 there were like 7,000 Marshallese people in the U.S. 10 years later there were 22,000. So, and this is just to show that the map is to show that Marshall Islands, if you look at it at this scale, you wouldn't see any land because it's really small. So the questions here. So we know that Marshall Islands is really vulnerable to climate change. We know that a lot of people migrate from the Marshall Islands, but what we don't know is whether these two are linked, right? That could be coincidence, like two things happening simultaneously. But we are really interested to know whether people are already migrating because of climate change. Now, the second question here, originally, before today's presentation, we said, what are the impacts of migration in source and destination areas? So within the Marshall Islands and in their destination areas in the US. But today's workshop is about resilience, building resilience. So I was thinking, well, probably you can just rephrase this question, and then it's about resilience. So we can say, instead of what is the impact of migration, we ask, is migration a successful adaptation in this case? Does it make people and places more resilient to climate disaster? I think it's important to realize that it's not like we have climate change and we have migration. Like people don't migrate because the climate is changing. There's a whole series of things in between. So because of climate change, there are impacts on ecosystem services. People depend on those ecosystem services for their livelihood and for their security. And when those are affected, they have to choose. Can we adapt locally, or do we move to a safer place, or a place that provides better income opportunities or survival opportunities? Now, this is what we call the climate migration impact chain, to emphasize that there's so much in between. And you also see that above and below that center chain, there's a lot of factors that also influence people's that affect ecosystems, not just climate change, but a whole range of other things. And also, people's migration decisions are only actually usually to a very small extent, informed by environmental factors. So, in the Marshall Islands, we studied three places, three islands: the capital island, Majuro, and then Medjid Island, and then Malolap Atoll. And important, often in this kind of migration research, people or researchers only go to the source area of migrants or destination area of migrants, but it's a bit rare that both places are integrated in the study. So we try to do that. I have done the fieldwork in Marshall Islands. Juno, who you saw in the first picture, has done the work in Hawaii, and she's now going to do research in the continental US. And Mark Steggy, who is from the Marshall Islands, also joined in the Marshall Islands fieldwork. So just very quick, this is just a map showing where Marshallese people are in the US. They're primarily in Hawaii. Then the second most important destination is Arkansas. It's a bit surprising maybe for some people. They work in poultry factories there. And then in the northwest corner, Washington State. So here you see three different like satellite images of the three islands we studied in the Marshall Islands. And these are quite different. So the two, Malolap and Majuro, are atolls, and Medjid is an island, and the scales are really different. Actually, this island which maybe looks like it has more territory. In reality, you could walk from one side to the other in maybe like, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes or so. So it's really small. And the dots you see there are the households we interviewed. Just a few pictures to give you a bit of context, like what does it look like where we did the research in the Marshall Islands. So this is Majuro, the capital island, and as you see, there are a lot of people living there in a small area. Here, this is Medjid, the island, and here you see this is a relatively high island. So usually, in Marshall Islands, the places that are islands are a little bit higher up, and the atolls are a bit lower and more exposed to sea level rise. Here is Majuro again. Like in the previous picture, you saw there's a beach that goes up a bit and it's a bit protected. But here in Majuro is actually between the sea and the land. There's just like, I don't know, half a meter of difference. And I'm from the Netherlands myself, and I just added a picture of what, when I came to Majuro, to this island, and I say, how is this possible? It's like the sea is here and the house is there, and they're so close together. The difference is like 1 meter. And what I'm used to seeing when I go to the beach in the Netherlands is that here's the sea, and you have these dunes, and it's really well protected, and the houses are actually maybe a few kilometers ahead. So we'll come to this later. There was some other surprise I will tell you later. So this is one of the main economic activities on the outer islands. That's cobra. They dry this and sell it. This is one of the. So you have coconut trees, you have pandanus trees, and you have breadfruit trees. And apart from that, it's not much that grows there. This is on Majuro, the capital island, which is more urban. Because of crowding there, it's worth the effort to actually try to gain land for living, and they use sometimes also rubbish as sort of landfills to gain land. I didn't do a study of whether that is sustainable or not. Maybe it is actually a transformative solution. I don't know. Here, drought. The islands the Marshall Islands in general has been hit by a drought of a few years, and so apart from sea level rise, drought is really a key issue because the soil water is increasingly saline. They depend on the rainwater for drinking water, but if it doesn't rain enough, then you have a problem. So these water tanks do help quite a bit for that. Okay. I have to rush a bit, I think. So I'll just say quickly that the kind of methods we used was very diverse. This is social science. I'm a human geographer. We do some mapping too, but a lot of it is just talking to people, but with very different like research tools. One of them is quite novel. It's an old method, but it's new to apply it to this climate migration research, this Q methodology, where very central to it is people's perceptions of their environment and people's perceptions of whether migration can be part of a solution or is more problematic. So we have all these statements on cards, and people have to say for each statement whether they agree, disagree, or whether they're sort of neutral about it, or they don't care, or they don't know. And then after that, they have to sort all the cards in order of agreement. And then you do more statistic analysis on what kind of different worldviews you see within your population, or shared views within the population. So different like typologies. Okay. Few quick slides on findings. First on climate change, or climate change impacts actually. So people are really concerned about climate change, but in reality, and that was a bit to my surprise, I come back to that photo of the beach. For me, it was impossible to imagine that the sea is here and the house is there, and that's not already a huge impact. But what we saw in our 3 study sites is that surprisingly, like flooding of their houses and flooding of their infrastructure was actually quite rare. So they see it more as like a future threat. So on drivers of migration, so what we actually found, and it's a bit in line with what I just said, climate impacts. When we talk to the people we interviewed, they do not bring up climate-related stressors as reasons to migrate. They actually, if we go quickly to the last bullet there, they do see the climate impacts as a reason why those people who are already, like in Hawaii or in the US, they are a bit more exposed to news and media on climate change, and they are worried that they might not be able to return safely to their home areas. A few other findings here: education, economic, lifestyle reasons were most prominent, and healthcare. That was very exceptional. I've done this kind of research in like 6 or 7 countries across the world, and health rarely came up. But importantly, for the Marshallese people, they have like free access to the United States because of the Compact of Free Association. So compared to many other locations, they have that option. Well, if they can raise the money for coming to the U.S. But in many other countries, that's not the case. Okay, so that's on the drivers of migration. So it's not really, people don't really see it yet as a major driver of migration and climate change. Impacts. So that here we link a bit to resilience, I guess, because if migration has positive impacts on the communities that migrants come from, we could say that maybe migration helped build resilience locally, right? Because maybe if you are living in the Marshall Islands and your house is affected or destroyed in a storm or a flood, and you have a brother or a sister or a child living in the U.S. Having more access to cash, then you could ask them to send money for support. So in that way, migration could be a way to enhance resilience. But actually, from our research, people were quite critical about the impacts of migration. So they mentioned positive factors and negative factors, but the negative factors were a bit more dominant. Okay, I'm gonna end with this, like sort of a general finding, I guess. So what we see is, yes, people are concerned about the future of their islands, so they feel they're not yet well prepared for future impacts. But one thing that came out very strongly is that they really resist the idea that someday their islands are going to become uninhabitable and that they would be forced to move. That's a very, very strong feeling that we saw across many, many interviews. So one thing they often said, that's like the quote that was repeated so many times: "Don't give up on us." So they are hopeful that between now and a future when climate change really becomes an existential threat, between then and for now and then, there will be solutions for them. All right, thank you. Here's some more information on the website. And
Thank you. And I that's an important message for all of us. We can't give up on this, and we certainly can't give up on our friends who are surrounded by water at all times. So I think we're getting close to our time, but I would love to open this up for questions from the audience, because we've certainly had remarkably inspirational messages about the resilience of the people in the Marshall Islands. They're determined to find ways to succeed. In the Mariana Islands, you're already working on the hard work of regulating decisions so that ensuring protection measures are taken. And the insurance world is backing up everyone's efforts to make sure that they can rebuild in the event of extreme weather or other hazards. So I'll open it up, and we have a question right here. I think we have microphones. If you could just state your name as well and let us know who the question is for. Perhaps we'll take 3 questions in a row and allow folks to answer, and then I'll wait for Roger Mark to tell me if my time's up. Yeah.
Hello, my name's David Baxter. I'm a senior PPP advisor to the newly formed International Public-Private Partnership Resilience Center in Louisiana, which has been formed in partnership with the United Nations Economic Commission in Europe. And what we're looking at is how public-private partnerships, and I mean more the formally structured ones between companies and governments to build resilient infrastructure. We're looking at introducing resilience factors, robustness, redundancy, etc., to infrastructure. And one of the areas that we are finding is that the private sector is becoming more aware of the risk to their projects, because if they're going to invest money in long-term PPPs, for example, they want to ensure that they're going to get a return on their risk. And I was just wondering for the panel, and maybe especially for Thomas, when we start talking about insurance and the available insurance for these type of formally structured PPPs, what the trends are. Many companies are, they're taking measures to protect their investments, but they don't necessarily call it resilience. They just call it economic survival or economic common sense. But I was just wondering what trends there are in the insurance industry. Thank you.
Great. Other questions?
Hi, Taylor Dimsdale with E3G. I think there's quite a bit that we know on the technical side, I think, in terms of what's possible from a risk assessment, risk management standpoint, what the models are telling us about impacts. I was wondering if the panelists could talk a bit about some of the political challenges, I guess, that are raised when you think about resilience. So I think improving that raises some difficult, some decisions need to be made about who's responsible, who holds responsibility, who pays for these impacts, or who pays for improving the system. So I'd be curious for insights just based on the work that you've done. Thanks.
Thank you, Taylor. One last question. Let's see one right here.
Sam Capasso, FEMA, and wanted to ask, is there anything that's going on to track and measure resilience so you can see what's working and what's not working?
Thank you. All right, we have 3 questions, one on public-private partnerships, one on political challenges, and then measuring resilience.
I'm not the measuring person, but for the first 2, I'm the man. I'm your man. So concerning trends, there is a transition in the insurance industry because the big data issue is coming, dynamics of globalization. There's a lot of money in the markets, too much money. Markets are soft, as we say, and insurers are looking for new markets, new models. And innovation is the buzzword. You go to Allianz, Munich Re, Swiss Re, we talk about innovation all the time. So, but linking it to policy or private partnerships, the problem is the insurers know there's a lot of money in the Green Climate Fund, in the Adaptation Fund. hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's so hard to get it, and it takes a long time, and you need to have a long accreditation until you get access to at least fund, and then if they give it, they look for a broad portfolio, so you again only get a piece of the cake. So there is a large interest in the whole insurance industry to tap new markets, new partnerships with policymakers, and also linked to climate change. But this is a big problem because timelines are so different, and the private sector says, where's the business case? How many policies tomorrow? How many after 1 year? So waiting for policy processes is what I would say is one of the biggest problem, and this gets me directly to the second from Taylor is you must just think about what is the management cycle of an insurance underwriter, an insurance manager, or a politician. In Germany, we have Chancellor Merkel, so it might be 20 years, but an insurance person might have, an insurance manager typically has 10 years. This is his time he's around. Policymaker, he needs quick results. He does not invest in long term, as we know. So I would say the biggest challenge is to get these timelines and management lines together. And if we don't assure long-term commitment and political will on both sides, it will fail. And this is a thing that the insurance industry found out in the mid-90s. So when there were hurricanes, and then Swiss Re, Munich Re, and others said, okay, we need to help these people, even if it's not a big deal of money, but we have a responsibility. So they wanted to help, for example, Honduras after Hurricane Mitch. And then they came, to the government and said, well, can you, we need data. We need all your data, text data, everything in order to create a solution. But at that time, they were not willing to share. So this is the other story that, like you and ISD are trying to get together, private sector and insurers. But the question is, who shares what? And this is very difficult. So I don't see a quick solutions and low-hanging fruits, but the interest definitely is there.
Great. Aaron, thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. And just to add on to that, I mean, there is a real political divide regarding risk allocation, who should bear the costs of paying for adaptation. However, there is a business case for investing in adaptation early in the process, so you are not paying, $4 instead of $1, right, upon your investment. So just a note on that, although I can't really speak to insurance directly. Regarding political challenges, though, resilience is not a contentious or a divisive issue. Everybody wants to have resilient systems. I think my governor is a Republican. We have a Republican-controlled legislature in the Marianas, and they are very supportive of ecological protection because they understand the connection of our economy to the environment. And so for us, that case is clear. And I am very fortunate, again, to work in a system that is not divided on the issue of whether or not we are experiencing climate impacts, because people in coastal areas see them. And whether or not you attribute them to people or not, I think the time now is, the time to act is now, and so that's important. And then just regarding how we track our interventions, that's been a challenging issue that we've been discussing this week at the Resilience Academy. And there's certainly some guidance at the national level regarding tracking investment, seeing how that builds resilience at local levels. However, one of the themes that we've been discussing is the importance of having a participatory bottom-up approach and having communities develop those metrics and in order to have buy-in to that process and really own the results. And that helps, I think, drive and inform the process as well. And that's something we hope to continue to work on in my agency in the Marianas.
On the second questions, like on political dimensions, just speaking from my experience from Marshall Islands, but not speaking for them because they have very powerful representatives of their own country. But I think what we see there in that last slide I showed is that we don't give up. Don't give up on us. So they want to explore, and they are sure that they're going to be successful in keeping their islands like habitable for the future. And that's for like these countries tend to be quite like small economies. So and some of the investments needed to keep those places habitable might be big. So That's, I guess, where like global politics comes in, and these things are being discussed in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in the negotiations. But it seems that there is some consensus that there would be, support from the countries that are have contributed more to global warming to support on that adaptation. I think that there is consensus, but of course where there is a lack of consensus is how that actually plays out, and then actually paying and for it. So we're seeing big challenges there, but maybe also we see progress there, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I did mention that I had a legal career. There's a very famous case of how do you define pornography in the legal system. And there's a very famous resolution of that issue that the Supreme Court decided we can't define it. You know it when you see it. With resilience, we also resolved that there were many definitions of resilience, but one thing I'm confident of, we have seen fantastic examples of resilience being built, understood, creative solutions that really offer a great deal of hope that we can have a big impact on reducing the risks posed by climate change. So I want to ask our audience to join me in thanking this extraordinary panel for sharing their extraordinary work.